I'm Chris Lample from TestObject, and today I'll be introducing you to test automation with Appium. Just so I can get an idea, can I see a quick show of hands who's already doing test automation for mobile development? Okay, cool. And how many of you are doing this with Appium specifically? All right, thanks. I'll keep that in mind as I go through my presentation. So a little bit about me. I'm a test automation engineer at TestObject. My responsibilities include test automation projects for clients and also for proof of concept. So this is given me the opportunity to write Appium tests in a few of the different languages that Appium supports. Also, I work to develop infrastructure for people running Appium tests on TestObject. And also, I support TestObject users. So this last bit has exposed me to the sticking points that people have getting started with TestObject, or with Appium. And I'll try and help you get over the sticking points, so that way you don't need to face them getting started with Appium. So a little bit about TestObject. We're a cloud-based platform for mobile testing. So this means that we have hundreds of real Android and iOS devices that you can run both manual and automated tests on. And we have a fast-growing customer base, including small startups, but also large enterprise customers. So regardless of where you are on the spectrum, there's room for you on our platform. And we're based here in Berlin. And we support multiple automation frameworks, but Appium is the core one that we support, advocate for, and also contribute to. So there are a few challenges in the mobile development world, but a key one is device fragmentation. We need to support different operating systems, different operating system versions, and also make sure that our app renders nicely on different screen sizes. So this graph here shows just how fragmented the device world is. The different panels correspond to different models, and the size corresponds to market share. And so we can't just test on a few different devices and expect that our users will have a bug-free experience across this whole range of device models. Last year, there were around 25,000 different Android models, so there's a lot of devices out there to test on. And not facing this challenge effectively can cost you money. Users will delete your application or leave your website if they experience too many bugs. And if they become frustrated, they might leave negative reviews on your App Store listing, which leads potential users to not download your application in the first place. Manual testing alone can be very effective for reproducing specific bugs, but trying to fully test your application across a wide range of devices will really quickly become unmanageable and very time-consuming. So the key to facing this challenge is test automation. With test automation, we can shorten our release cycle. So automated testing gives developers immediate feedback on new builds. After we've already automated our test cases, we can trigger them very easily to run in parallel across a suite of devices without needing any human intervention and without needing to go through a time-consuming process of manually testing your application across all of these devices. And doing this, running your automated test on a suite of devices, will allow you to release your application with confidence that it's bug-free on all of these devices. Test automation can also help you increase App Store ratings. With only manual testing, it's difficult to cover a wide range of devices. Most of us just don't have the resources to do this. And it's possible that there will be bugs on some of these devices that we failed to test on. Users with these devices, as I mentioned earlier, will become frustrated as they experience bugs, and they'll leave negative ratings on your App Store listing. Automated tests, as I mentioned earlier, can easily be triggered to run on a suite of devices without any human intervention. And so this scales very well to cover a wide range of devices. And because we can scale it to cover all these devices that we wouldn't have tested on with manual testing alone, we can make sure that users don't experience these bugs in the first place that would lead them to leave negative reviews on our App Store listing. Test automation is also more efficient than manual testing alone. Test automation requires an initial investment of focus to automate key use cases of the application, and also to not only become accustomed to this new technology, Appium, but also to become accustomed to a new way of doing things. Still, as your test cases accumulate and you gain experience with the framework, your test coverage will grow, and also the rate at which you can add new use cases will become even faster. So to illustrate this, let's say that we're only manual testing, and we want to double the number of use cases that we cover, double the number of devices that we test on, or double the frequency with which we run our tests. Doubling any of these factors with manual testing alone will require doubling the amount of resources that we put into testing. With automated testing, we've already written our test cases, and we can run them on twice as many devices or twice as frequently without any additional resources. And as our test automation code base grows, if done properly, new use cases will become faster and faster to automate. So with test automation, you can take advantage of some of these key benefits that I outlined. And this will free up time for your manual testers. And so your manual testers can focus on reproducing specific bugs, or they can check hard to automate test cases that you might just not be able to automate. And you don't need to automate all of your tests to begin getting some of these benefits. You just need to start automating some of the core use cases, and you'll start to see these, and you'll start to save time and energy. So there are a lot of different solutions out there for test automation, but Appium has some key advantages. A large one is flexibility. You'll see here from this chart that other frameworks bind you to a specific programming language. So if you want to get started, but you don't have any expertise in this programming language, your onboarding process to test automation will be much longer because you need to take the time to learn this new language. With Appium, Appium supports multiple programming languages, so you can just choose whichever one you're most comfortable with and get started. Also, Appium supports both Android and iOS for test automation. So there's no need to learn two different frameworks if you're developing an application for both platforms. To dive a little bit more into this, as I mentioned earlier, Appium is cross-platform, supporting both iOS and Android. So a key advantage of this is that if you have a similar application on both platforms, you can write one test set in such a way that it runs your test on both platforms. And you can leverage the similarities between the applications on the two platforms to reuse a lot of code, and this will make automating your tests much simpler because you're reusing the code, it'll be faster, and so in addition to supporting iOS and Android, Appium is already working to add Windows support, and this is on the roadmap to be added in a future release. Appium is also cross-technology, so you can automate native applications, hybrid applications, and also web applications. So you don't need to worry. If your company starts developing applications with one technology and then moves to using another technology, for example, developing hybrid applications and then moving to native applications, you won't need to drop all of your tests and start from scratch and learn a whole new framework. You can continue to use Appium, which is very nice. As a quick side note, for those of you who might not know, native applications are developed specifically for Android or iOS. Hybrid applications are developed using web technologies but run in a thin native container. And web applications are just websites designed with these mobile users in mind. And we need to make sure that the website renders properly on their different screen sizes. So to make things even better, like I mentioned earlier, Appium is clients in several popular technology or languages. So this means that you can test in the language of your choice. You don't need to make the process of getting started with test automation even longer by needing to learn a whole new language. You can just choose whichever one you or your team has the most experience with and just get started right away. So I know this sounds too good to be true. Let's take a look at how Appium achieves this flexibility. So Appium uses a client-server architecture. So you automate your test case using the language of your choice, and this is our Appium client here, which is the Appium test itself. And this is what we're actually working on when we're automating our tests. Our test, the Appium client, then communicates with the Appium server using a standardized JSON wire protocol. So regardless of what language we wrote our tests in, they're all communicating with the Appium server in the same protocol, and so we know that our tests will run fine, regardless of which language we choose to move forward with. And we don't need to worry about this communication with the server when we're writing our tests. The libraries that Appium has written in these different languages handle all this work for us. So the Appium server can run locally on your laptop, and you can be automating a device that's just sitting right next to you on your table. Or the Appium server can be in the cloud, and you can be automating dozens of devices in parallel. And one advantage of Appium is that we don't need to make any heavy changes to our test case to move from testing locally on devices that we have to testing on a large number of devices in the cloud. We just need to point our test script at a different endpoint, and Appium does all the work for us. The Appium server then responds to our tests by interacting with the device, and it leverages existing tools to interact with the device. And so regardless of whether you're automating for Android or iOS, you don't need to worry about differences for the most part between the two libraries. Appium sort of handles this work of interacting with the device for us, and it exposes a single standard way that you can learn to interact with the devices. So there's a philosophy driving the development of Appium. So let me introduce that to you. You shouldn't need to recompile your app or modify it in order to automate your application. So you don't even need the source code of your application. We're not actually worrying about what's in the app itself. We're testing the application from the perspective of a user and trying to detect bugs that they'll come across in using our application. And one key advantage of not needing to make major modifications to our application is that it closes the gap between the application that we're testing and making sure it's bug-free and the application that we're actually releasing. If we test this heavily modified application and make sure it's bug-free, how do we know that this other version of the application is still going to be bug-free, the one that we're actually releasing? So Appium solves this problem for us. Appium also believes that you shouldn't be locked into a specific language or framework to write and run your tests. So as I pointed out earlier, you can write your tests using Java, Ruby, Python, JavaScript, C#, and you don't need to use some language that's determined by the framework. Appium's extremely flexible that way. And we don't need to learn multiple frameworks to automate for an application on Android and iOS. The third point is that a mobile automation framework should be open source in spirit and practice, and also in name. So Appium is a thriving community around it. If you have problems testing, there are places where you can find solutions, and someone's probably already posted a solution. Some good resources for getting help, getting started automating your tests are the Appium Discuss forum, and also Appium on GitHub, and you can look at the issues that have been opened, and usually there's a lot of good information there. And also, because Appium has this thriving community around it, you can count on Appium to stay up to date with changes in the mobile world. For example, Appium's already working on integrating with Apple's XCUI tests to interact with iOS devices. And as I mentioned earlier, Appium's already working to add support for testing applications on Windows. And the fourth point is a mobile automation framework shouldn't reinvent the wheel when it comes to APIs. So Appium isn't starting from scratch to interact with the device. It's leveraging these existing stable tools to do that for us. And even though there are different tools for automating tests on Android and on iOS, Appium handles this work for us, and we don't need to worry about these differences. We just need to interact with this one framework that does all the work for us. And because Appium doesn't try and start from scratch in interacting with the devices, it's able to focus on making our testing experience as easy as possible. And it's a much more stable platform and usable platform because of this. So I've introduced you to the philosophy behind Appium and reasons why you should use test automation. Let's dive in and see what actual Appium tests look like. So this is a typical Appium test. As I mentioned earlier, we aren't worrying about communicating with the Appium server. And we aren't worrying about the underlying tools for interacting with the device. We're just using Appium's library, which is here in the driver, to find elements and click elements and interact with the UI. So in our test cases, this isn't unit testing, and we aren't testing any code directly from the source code of the application. What we're doing is we're testing from the perspective of the user, and we're trying to find bugs that they'll come across in using their application. So we're finding UI elements, and we're interacting with them, clicking buttons, and filling out forms. And then finally, we make some assertion about the UI to make sure that the interactions that we had with our application had the effect that we intend them to have. And so, yeah, our tests are closely mimicking the user's use case, and we're trying to find bugs that they'll actually come across in using our application. So this is a typical Appium test, but there were some problems with it. We're mixing high and low levels of abstraction. So it's hard to get a clear idea of what this test is actually doing just by reading it. There are a lot of small interactions that will be involved in our use cases, and we don't want to worry about those when we're writing our tests. We want to focus on high-level things that are happening in interacting with the application. And there's no code reuse here. We're just hard coding in how we find all of the elements in our test case, and we're kind of starting from scratch. What we want to do is make our tests more readable and start reusing our code, because while that's fine for a small number of test cases, as we try and increase our test coverage, we don't want to be starting from scratch every time we automate a new use case. We want to be reusing the work that we've already done, and we want, as we scale up to dozens or maybe 100 different use cases that we're testing, we want these all to be readable, because it's hard to keep them all in your mind, what they're actually testing. So the way to do this is with the page object design pattern. We'll encapsulate these low-level interactions and expose more high-level human-style interactions. For example, submitting a budget. And this will make our test cases more readable, and it'll also improve code reuse, because we're no longer starting from scratch when writing these use cases. We're just reusing different methods that we've implemented in our page object. So this is an example of what that same test case will look like after refactoring it with page object. And I think you can see that this is much more readable than the first test case. Without being familiar with the application itself or with our test code here, you can get a clear idea of what the test is actually doing. And as you continue to improve your test coverage with automated testing, and you have dozens or 100 test cases, Making your tests clear and readable like this and reusing all the code is really the, I believe, only maintainable way to do this. So there are a few key components for this design pattern. We have our test cases, which you just saw an example of. We also have our page objects, which are where we're encapsulating the low-level interactions with the device and exposing more high-level ways to interact with the application. Then we also have a data class. Depending on what type of application you're automating, you might end up with a lot of different test data. And rather than have this hard-coded in the test cases or in the page objects, we want to factor it out. So that way we can quickly change it as needed. And this will also make our tests more readable. So let's look at our test case again. A few more points about this. We see that it's actually mimicking the interaction that a user would have with our application. We're skipping an intro screen, filling in details, selecting a new building project, and then finally we're making some assertion that these interactions that we had, selecting a new building project, triggers some dialog box correctly. And all of this code, these ways that we're interacting with the application, are actually all connected to pages on our application, different screens. It's not all jumbled together into one big mess. It's very organized. When we know in our use case that we're on a particular page within our application, then we can just check what methods are available on that page. What ways can we interact with that page? And then in our test cases, we can just leverage these. And this allows for a lot of code reuse, which is very nice. And with an IDE like IntelliJ, autocomplete, once you know what page you're going to be on and you type that part out, you'll already see what ways you can interact with that. And once your page objects become mature and you've already written all these methods, adding a new use case to your test will be as simple as just chaining together all these calls. And it becomes very simple. So we still need to handle our low-level interactions with the device. And we do this in our page objects. So since a use case, like in this case, creating an invoice, can involve finding and interacting with maybe these two forms and all these different low-level elements, we want to encapsulate this and expose only the high-level interactions to our test cases. Rather than finding the different fields and entering some values, we just want to expose fill details or fill budget or fill date. Our logic in this class is separated into two pieces. So at the top, we're finding the elements on the page, and we're doing this using annotations. At the bottom, we're interacting with these elements to define our methods, the high-level ways that we'll actually be interacting with this page. A key thing to point out is that our page objects are corresponding to actual pages on the application. That's a really strong way to structure this low-level interactions with the application. And currently, this test is only supporting Android. As you can see, there are only Android find by annotations. But like I mentioned earlier, Appium supports Android and iOS. And we can even support a similar application that runs on both platforms using the same test. And this will allow us to reuse a lot of code and make developing our tests much faster. So this is especially true when you implement your tests using PageObject. To support iOS, we would simply need to add a new annotation above where we find these elements, iOS find by, and we would need to specify how to find these elements because you'll need to find them using a different selector on iOS than what we're already using for Android. And so because our tests are organized nicely and finding the elements is confined to a specific part of our code base, we won't need to make very major changes in order to go from supporting just Android to supporting both Android and iOS with a single test. So, as I mentioned earlier, depending on the type of application that you have, as your test cases grow, you might start having a lot of test data. So, it makes a lot of sense to factor this out rather than hard code it in your page objects or your test cases. Doing this, none of our data is duplicated. It's all in one location. So if for some reason we need to quickly change our test data that we're using, we just come to our data class and change it there in one spot. We don't need to hunt through the different places where we hard coded it and change our data in each and every one of these. Also, it really improves the readability of our tests. So it's much easier for me, I think, to read data.invoice amount than some magic number like 10, where we don't know where that's coming from. So I've shown you what a Appium test looks like. Let's actually see how we can run this in the cloud. Okay, so I'll actually run the tests later in the talk, but right now I'll just show you a test that I ran earlier today, this test. Our tests are organized using TestObject suite runner. So without making very major changes to our Appium test, we can run it on a full suite of devices at once without needing to do anything additional. And we see a history of the results of running our test. So these are our two test cases that we've automated. And with every test case, you have access to some of different resources associated with the test case. So an important thing with all these different screen sizes that we'll need to support is making sure that the application renders correctly on all of them. And so within your Appium test, you can make calls to take a screenshot. And we have these organized here all in one place. And here we see the page that we actually implemented using a page object. If something goes wrong, or we want to see what our app actually looks like under this use case, we can just watch a video of the test case. And this is really valuable for me when the test is failing and I want to see where is it going wrong, what am I not expecting. For example, automating this application on some of the devices, the euro sign wasn't rendering as I expected. And because I was comparing in my assertion that the dollar amount was correct with this euro sign, I was running into issues. And so coming and looking at the videos can really help automate your test cases. And as I mentioned earlier, all of the communication between the Appium client and the Appium server, regardless of what language you're automating your tests using, is in this standardized JSON wire protocol. And here we see the actual communication between the Appium client and the Appium server. And it's actually not that intimidating. It can be easy to read. Here we're clicking the back button on the device, setting a timeout, finding some elements. And so if you want to see where Appium is maybe throwing an error or how it's responding to our different requests, it can be useful to come and look at the communication between the Appium client, our test case, and the Appium server. And then finally, we have device logs and Appium logs. So if our application is crashing on some device, it can be very useful to be able to just download the logs and send them to the app developers. So we've automated our tests and we can run them on a suite of devices. But to take full advantage of our tests, we want to be able to run them in continuous integration, like Jenkins, or on our colleague's laptop. We want to be able to easily distribute them anywhere we'd like. But at the same time, we want to take advantage of Appium's flexibility. And we want to develop our tests using whatever language we want. This can be a problem because then you need to install all of these languages in all these environments. And this can be a real pain because maybe you don't have control over your colleague's laptop when they're trying to run your tests. You don't want to need to go over there and help them get started. So to solve this issue, we'll use Docker to expose a single standard interface for running our Appium tests. So in this talk, I won't give a full introduction to Docker. I'm just going to focus on how it relates to our use case. So Docker is already an important tool in DevOps, and it's used to simplify the deployment and testing of software. It supports containers, which act as sandbox environments. And these containers can include your dependencies and software. And you can run the same container locally on your laptop, your staging environment, and your production environment. And this helps narrow the gap between our development and our production environment, and it can make deploying our software easier and lead to quicker release cycles. So running the same setup across different environments is exactly what we're looking for. Rather than use Docker to deploy production software, let's use it to distribute our Appium tests. So first we'll create an image containing our test and dependencies, and then we'll build a container using our image. And this will actually automatically trigger our Appium tests. And every time we want to run our Appium tests, we'll just create a new container using our image. And we're able to distribute this image across our organization using a Docker registry. And it won't matter what language our tests are written in or which operating system they're being run on. We can always start our Appium tests using the same Docker run command. So let's take a close look at how to actually integrate Appium with Docker. The configuration file for building our Docker images is called a Docker file. So here's the Docker file for the tests that we've just investigated together. At the top line, we're specifying the base image to start with. Our tests were written using Java, so we're starting with a base image that already has Java installed. We then move our test into the Docker image. So Docker containers are going to be sandbox environments, almost like virtual machines. So we need to take our test cases that are on our laptop and actually move them into the image or container so that way they can be run. And we do this here with the add command. And the last two lines are actually for running our Appium tests. So this line here will set up our Appium tests and import all the dependencies. And this is run when we're building our image. The final line actually automatically triggers our Appium tests. And this line will be run whenever we create a new Docker container from this image. So I'll give a quick demo of finally running our tests now that we've integrated them with Docker. So right now, I'm in a folder with all of our tests and the Docker file. And I can take these tests and build a Docker image with them using the Docker build command. So here we're building our Docker image, and right now we're importing all the dependencies that we need to run our Docker, or to run our Appium test. And so one of the nice things about this is that we'll only need to import all these dependencies once, and when we create new containers to actually run our Appium tests, since they're already included in the Docker image, we won't need to do this work again. Okay, so we've successfully built the Docker image. Now let's take a look inside the Docker container. Normally, when we create a Docker container, using this Docker image, it will trigger our Appium test, but rather than do this, I'll actually go inside of it and we can take a look. So here, this changed because we're actually no longer on my host system. We're actually inside of a Docker container now, which is a sandbox environment similar to a virtual machine. So we can take a look and we see all of our test cases that we've just added into the Docker container. And yeah, here we see the file system. Yeah, this is a totally separate environment, sandboxed, and it has all of our dependencies included in it, in this case, Java. And so we can run this Docker container anywhere where Docker is installed. So we don't need to worry and make sure that they have the language that we wrote our Appium test in. And right now, I'll use the docker run command to create a Docker container from this image that we just built. And this will automatically trigger our Appium test to run in the cloud on a suite of devices. And this command will be the same whether we automated our Appium test using JavaScript or C#. There will be no difference. And this is useful for letting your colleagues run it. They won't need to worry about, well, what command do I need to actually trigger these Appium tests? And so we see here that our tests are actually running. Let's go back to the suite. And we see here in the cloud that we've actually successfully triggered our Appium tests. So I've already showed you what the test results look like, so I won't take a second look at these. So we've covered a few things in this talk. We've taken a look at some of the challenges that people face in mobile development. How can we make sure that users, regardless of what device they have a bug-free experience using our app? And we've seen just how important it is to effectively handle this issue. If we fail to make sure that users have a bug-free experience, this can cost us money, and they might leave negative reviews on our App Store listing. And we've seen that test automation is an invaluable tool for mobile development, and it really allows us to challenge this issue, or solve this issue of device fragmentation. And we've seen that Appium is a flexible and powerful tool for test automation. We won't need to learn multiple frameworks to test native app and also a hybrid app, or to test iOS app and also an Android app. And we've seen that with Appium and using a good design pattern, needing to automate for both Android and iOS can actually be simple, because we can reuse a lot of code to test on these two different platforms. We've also seen that the page object design pattern keeps our tests maintainable. The first test that we looked at without page object was okay. And it does a proper job of making sure that this use case is covered on a particular device. But as we try and scale up to have dozens or 100 test cases, and we need to maintain these test cases as possibly the application is changing, or maybe we need to look back and see why a test is now failing and interpret the results, it's extremely important to use a clean design pattern like page object. So that way we are reusing code, our code isn't duplicated, and we can quickly adjust to changes in the application. And also, it'll make our test cases much more readable. We want to be able to look and see what exactly is happening in this use case. What are we actually doing at a high level with the application? Also, we've seen how to integrate our tests with Docker for portability. Appium has a lot of flexibility, so we can develop our tests in any language. But we want to make sure that it's easy to run our tests in a continuous integration environment or for our colleagues to also use our tests. So by integrating our tests with Docker, we expose a single standard way for actually running the tests. And it gives us a way to distribute our tests using a Docker registry, for example. And we've also taken a look at how we can run our tests in the cloud to gain access to a large number of devices. When you're dealing with device fragmentation and trying to test on a lot of different devices, it can be expensive and consume a lot of resources to not only purchase all of these devices, but to also have an organized way of running tests on all of them and maintaining them, and also keeping a good history of what tests have been failing and why they've been failing. So running in the cloud takes no additional work really to configure your Appium test to run in this way. And it solves these issues for you. And you can focus on just automating your tests and making sure that your users have a bug-free experience. So do you all have any questions? I'd be happy to answer them. Yeah.
Sorry, yes, I've got a really nasty one for you.
Okay.
What about Chinese, Hindi, and Arabic? You showed us everything so far on a European screen. Can we use Appium to test our application if the user has a keyboard or their smartphone set up for Hindi, Arabic, or Chinese?
Yes, I believe so. I don't have experience automating in these languages,
yeah.
But I do know that some users are using Appium to cover these scenarios.
Okay,
but I'm not familiar with the details of actually doing this. But if they are running your application on a device with Android, running on Android or iOS, Appium will cover this for you, and you'll be able to test your application on their devices. Yes.
But does TestObject offer such languages on the virtualization platform? It's not virtualization. It's the mobile devices are in different languages, or are they only in?
Right. So in your application settings, you can select the device language, and this will change the device language for when you run your tests. Yes, please.
Yeah, we have a native Android and iOS app, and we use Appium actually to run our tests. But however, we have some, even though we use the level of abstractions and only have to write one test to run it on several platforms, but however, we struggle to create new tests or change existing tests, because so I'm not in the technical details, but what the developers say is that they it's really time consuming to identify these new GUI elements, especially in iOS, and also the tests run really long. It takes a long time to run these tests. So if you want to change a test and the test runs 5 minutes, because we have quite complex apps, and you want to see if the change really worked out, you have to wait like 5 minutes to see if it works out. So this is something what we are facing at the moment. Do you have similar experiences?
Yes, so I don't know what sort of workflow you're using to develop your tests, but I found that when developing the test, running it locally on a phone that we have on our table, and developing our tests on this device is a much faster workflow for making sure that our test actually works. And then when it comes time to actually test the application, like we're comfortable with our tests and we know that it works on this device here, then I would run it in the cloud on the suite of devices. So by running it on Appium locally, you aren't dealing with maybe waiting for a device to allocate. So I know that maybe if that helps or not depends on what your current workflow is.
I think they use devices locally.
Okay. Maybe my colleague has a...
Can I join in? So one thing is really you need really good communication between the people that are writing the tests and the devs, if the devs themselves are not actually doing that.
It's the same people.
It's the same people? Okay. Because a lot of time, like, we see that, you know, there are different ways of making lives easier for the testers. And so, for example, just knowing your way around IDs in iOS and how this works is kind of a big deal. And yeah, then again, I think really just writing the test locally and then using a platform that allows you to run in parallel on a lot of devices, that also is valuable. Yeah.
And the second question is it also possible to build apps in your cloud or just to let the test run? Because for some clients it's hard to get Mac into their data center, and would be would be really nice to have such a feature.
So I understand. Right now what you're doing is you're uploading the IPA or the APK to our platform, and then you're running manual tests or automated tests on it. So we aren't really a solution for
Executing,
actually,
but not for.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Where is your data center for TestObject?
It's in Henningsdorf, so it's here in Berlin, Germany, very local.
Okay,
Yes.
great.
And we also offer private on-premise solutions for enterprise customers who want to have the devices right next to them and maintain their own data center.
No.
Okay. I saw you had a question.
How do you solve the problem of accessing local resources? For example, if you have a website that is hosted on a test server on-premise, how do you connect that from the cloud?
So just to make sure I understand the question correctly, you're trying to test a website, or maybe you're trying to test a native application that connects to a server, and maybe this server is a test server and it's not available to the broad internet. In that case, the simplest solution is to whitelist our IP address that our devices connect to the internet with. They all use the same IP address, so you just need to whitelist this one IP address. And VPN we also offer.
Let's see, use the Docker container, does it have any means in it to run tests in parallel?
Right, so one piece of infrastructure that we've developed for running Appium tests on TestObject is our suite setup. So this is an extra library that you use, and it's a minor bit of configuration, and it allows you to run your tests in parallel on devices on TestObject. And you specify the devices on our website. You set up a suite on our website and select the devices there. Right now, running them in parallel using our suite setup is only supported for JUnit and Java, writing your tests using these languages, but we're working to broaden the support and make this available for people automating with other languages also. Outside of this, then you would need to find a way to create your own test runner, or you could also configure your Docker container and your Appium tests to read which device you're testing on using an environment variable maybe, and then you can have a script that creates all these Docker containers with the right environment variables. So yeah, these are some solutions. Yes, please?
You can use the Docker plugin, and from there you are starting containers from your
So setting this up with Jenkins, the workflow that I've used is you have your Jenkins server, and Docker is installed here. And what I would do is make this Docker container in our Appium test configurable by environment variables. So we need an API key to run our tests in the cloud, or maybe we have a flag if we're running maybe locally or in the cloud. And I would have Jenkins have a build parameterize with these and create the Docker container to use these environment variables. Yeah. I hope that answers your question. Okay, thank you. Yes?
Is there any way to, you can check use cases and clicking buttons, but some of the main problems is the layout of applications, different screen sizes and whatever. Is there any way to check layout, correct layout of the application?
So, the way to do this with Appium would be to, as I demoed here, have your Appium test take screenshots at key points in your application. And running it on the cloud, all of these screenshots will be organized for you. But you'll need to go through by hand and actually look at these screenshots and see, is this rendering the way I want? But also I think that this can be a good way to do it because what matters for how the application renders is maybe how it appears to you. And so it's good to maybe catch things rather than try and automate some solution here.
But there's no simple solution to see the simple case if the like a label is visible.
Yeah.
Is this possible?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
This would be the first step in seeing if the layout is good.
Yeah, Appium has commands. For example, you can check if an element is present or if an element is visible, and right, you could use these. Yes?
Do you have some facts about your data center, like how many smartphones do you have there, what time zone? How many tests run there in parallel, so if I start using it, do I have to wait until the phone is free, or does it start instantaneously?
So right now we have around 250, is that correct?
So we have 200 different models and iOS and Android, and depending on the popularity of the model, we might have more than one instance of it. Yep.
And you're right, for a public cloud, if someone else is testing on this device, you'll need to wait until it's available for your test to execute. We have a queuing system for this where if you start an Appium test and the device isn't available, you'll have 15 minutes for your test to start. We also have a private cloud, so if you don't want to deal with this issue of devices maybe not being available, you can set aside some devices where only you have access to these. How many tests are executed? I'm not actually sure. Sorry. Okay.
Security question then. If we have to log in, authenticate with what we're testing, and connection is lost, do you automatically drop the authentication, or could it be a case of the next person coming in, say this guy was waiting to use the phone, is he still am I still authenticated and he can access what I've been testing?
We do a very thorough device cleaning between every testing session. So we uninstall your app and we reset the device. And for maybe more high security enterprise customers, like a bank or something, we also offer a private cloud solution, or on-premise solution, where you actually host the devices. And
no, I'm not that paranoid. But
okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, sounds good. But yeah, we do have a device cleaning process, and we make sure that your app is uninstalled. And also for your Appium test, communicating with the Appium server on our cloud. This is done using HTTPS. So if you're sending passwords or usernames and credentials in your test case, this is secured.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Yes?
I have one question. We use Espresso for under testing, and I know you are supporting it, but you are saying that you are for pushing the developers to use Appium.
Yeah.
And is there any chance that you will discontinue support for the Espresso and just have one framework, or you wanna support as much as possible?
We like the other frameworks as well, and we're still developing them, and we know that our users like these also, and we do like them too. Yeah, and so we're always working to improve the experience for testing with these also.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So if you have any other questions that we didn't get a chance to answer, feel free to send me an email. I'll be happy to hear from you at clample@testobject.com. You can also swing by our booth downstairs and come talk to us. We have a demo where you can see these tests executed on some devices that we have here, basically on-premise setup here. And you can also sign up for a free trial at TestObject and get started trying to either run your tests on the cloud if you're already doing test automation, or get started with Appium. And we also have manual testing if you're only interested in that. And we also support other frameworks as well.